wanted the best? You've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. It's Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com. The Chris Voss Show.com. I don't know why we went long this time, but it seemed like something to do. Welcome to the big show, my family and friends. The Chris Voss Show family that loves you but doesn't judge you, at least not as harshly as your dad did when you came out of your mom and he looked at you and went, seriously, I want a daughter or I want a son. I don't know. Whichever it was, work it out with your psychotherapist. It's not my problem. But the Chris Voss Show is here for you for everything else that you psychologically need. We just can't fix why your mom didn't hug you enough as a child. So there you go. As always, please refer the show to your family and friends and relatives. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, TikTok at Chris Voss1, and I think there's YouTube in there somewhere. You guys know the drill. But as always, we love you. We appreciate you. And we hug you, even though your dad probably didn't, because as we aforementioned, we have an amazing gentleman on the show. He's a multi-book author, and he's got his hottest new book coming off the presses September 5th, 2023. Let's recut that. How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. Fredrik deBoer is on the show with us today. He's going to be talking about his latest book, and we're going to get insights that we're going to learn some crap today, people. Because that's what we do on the Chris Voss Show. We learn stuff and we get smarter, because when you're smarter, I don't know, you're sexier, you're more hot. I mean, look at me. It just gets hotter every day. Fredrik deBoer is the author of The Cult of Smart, a book about meritocracy, education, and the potential for a more humane society. What, has he seen the news lately? Yeah, we need some more humanity. It was selected by New York Magazine as one of its 10 best books of 2020. He holds a PhD in English from Purdue University, where he concentrated on the assessment of student learning. Welcome to the show, Fredrik. How are you?
I'm good, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
There you go. And I guess, is it okay if I call you Freddie through the show?
Of course.
There we go. So give us your .coms. Where can people find you on the internet and get to know you better?
Yeah, you can look for me at freddydeboer.substack.com. And you can also find my professional website at fredrikdeboer.com. That's mostly just a sort of where I warehouse old pieces, and you can find like my academic CV and stuff like that. But most of what I'm doing right now goes down on Substack.
There you go. So what motivated you to write this latest book?
Sure. I sort of looked around and I thought to myself, didn't we say a couple years ago that everything had changed? I mean, weren't we all talking about how society was sort of getting ripped up from the foundations and we were going to start over again, and there was going to be all this massive revolutionary evolution in how human beings think and act, and then just sort of nothing happened. And it wasn't just that we said all that stuff and that nothing happened, but that like very quickly after it became clear that nothing was happening, people sort of decided not to talk about the fact that nothing was happening. And I just felt like some serious stuff went down in 2020, some of which I agreed with, some of which I didn't. But definitely we said it was a special moment in history. And then it just passed like a fart into the air. And, I thought like we needed to take stock and figure out what exactly happened.
You know, I totally agree with you. I went into 2020 and we were holding court in a new app called Clubhouse. And it seemed like everyone was kumbayaing, getting together and holding hands and going, this is a moment that we need to recognize humanity. We need to be better people, maybe look towards our better angels, as some say it. And then as soon as it was over, it's like, everyone's like, all right, let's go back to being assholes. Or at least it seemed to be that way. I don't know. So I think I'm on the same level as you are. So the title of your book, give us a 30,000 overview of the book and what it entails. We'll get the deets.
Yeah. So looking back at the last sort of like 25 years of American progressive social change, but also particularly the 2020 moment, my argument is just that a big part of the problem for progressive people, left-leaning people, etc., is that the the class of people who sort of tries to make this change happen are not the class of people who we're trying to make change happen for. In other words, the people who are running these activist organizations, who are employees at the nonprofits, who work for the sympathetic press in the national media, who work at the universities. They are overwhelmingly people with college degrees. They're also hugely disproportionately coming from elite colleges. So a point that I make all the time that I think most people don't understand, going to a college that's like exclusive or elite is super, super rare. So only something like 20% of American colleges reject more students than they accept. The average American college accepts almost everybody who applies. So going to a college that is elite or exclusive is just a very, very thin slice of American life. So you have people who are hyper educated. They're dominantly found in urban enclaves. So they're vastly more sort of concentrated in the cities and the country writ large. They are possessed of a certain like vocabulary that most people don't speak. And in one way after another, they're not like sort of the ordinary American. And so you could see this in 2020 where you had a lot of passionate sort of like Black Lives Matter activists who I think had their hearts in the right place and who really cared, but whose experience of life in America in the 21st century is just not like the average Black American's experience of life. And over again, what you find and what I detail in the book is how that distance between their perspective and other people's perspective made it much harder for them to actually create change.
There you go. So who are the elites? I think you kind of give me a rundown of them. Do you mostly focus on what goes on the left side of our of the elite of the elites, or is it both sides, left and right? Or tell us how that you break that down and do that in the book.
I think that it doesn't have to be a left or right phenomenon. I think that if you look at the activist class of the Republican Party, for example, I think that there is a stereotype that, for example, your average pro-life protester, say your pro-life activist, is someone who is like a church lady who comes from rural Arkansas and is not educated. If you actually look at who's making things happen in the Republican Party, who the movers and the shakers are, they are also hyper educated. They also tend to be heavily concentrated in the cities. They often have a vocabulary that's very distinct from those of the people that they're talking about. Because I'm talking specifically about sort of, okay, why did the 2020 moment specifically not go anywhere? I'm focusing more on the left. But the reality is, you know, again, we have to be careful about sort of like what the median in this country is like compared to our sort of perception of who these people are. So I think if you look at 2016, there's this stereotype that the average Trump voter was like a laid off iron worker from Akron, Ohio, right? But if you look at the numbers, the median Trump voter in 2016 made $89,000 a year. Okay. like a lot of these guys are guys who they like own car dealerships, right?
Yeah.
Or
we should note that's quite above the average of normal Americans.
Yes, the median American makes something like $36,000.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, one of the sort of sad, persistent dynamics in American life is poor people don't vote, right? It's been a consistent, certainly as long as I've been alive and longer. If you look at the participation rates by income band, poor people just don't really vote. And so you get this stereotype where on the one hand, you have the sort of, country bumpkin MAGA, you know, Rust Belt guy who's angry about globalization. He put Trump into office. And then for Hillary Clinton, you know, it was probably, you know, the sort of the negative stereotype of like the Black welfare mother who doesn't do it. The reality is neither of those people vote in the American system. And like voting in and of itself is something of an elite practice.
Kind of the way it's designed too, the way the schedule is. I mean, let's put it on a weekday in the middle of the day when, most people that are lower income are, they just can't call in their boss and take the day off,
Right.
and some of the games that are played with voting and polling and stuff. So delving into it, the social justice movement, there was a lot of stuff that came out of it. George Floyd, there was a lot of kumbaya moments, and now we're kind of on the other side of it, and we're seeing, has it really worked out? Like we're seeing, all the different issues that we're seeing, the cars breaking into in San Francisco, and I want to make clear I'm not adding to the narrative I see on Fox News of like, oh my God, this is, the cities are burning and all that kind of crap. But there definitely is a higher sort of break-in and crime things going on in some cities. There seems to be a little bit of that going on. I don't know what percentages I've heard. It's actually fairly small, but you see the videos and you get an impression that it's complete chaos or something out there in the streets.
Yeah, I mean, the best read of the data that I have is that crime really did spike in 2020, and particularly murder. We saw a major spike.
I didn't do it, by the way. I just want to make that clear. It wasn't
not accusing you personally. It remains the case. The average American city, big city, is remarkably safe compared to where it was 25 years ago. And in the cities that are particularly dangerous, they tend to be concentrated within certain populations in certain geographic locations, right? So I think Baltimore has about 800,000 people, or less than that even. New York City has over 8 million people, but Baltimore has more total murders per year than New York City. So, right. So like, but Baltimore has, this problem is concentrated within the Black male population, overwhelmingly between 15 and 30 years old. And that's true in Chicago, and it's true in St. Louis, etc. If you are, as a tourist, go to these places and you are not frequenting the kind of places where gang violence happens, you remain in very little danger physically. I always tell my fellow lefties, though, that look, crime is an example, perfect example of where if enough people think there's a problem, there's a problem. In other words, I think the worst thing that you can do, if a voter says to you, wow, I don't feel safe at night, or the subway seems unsafe, so I don't want to ride it. If you say, well, I've got the stat book here, and I can tell you, you're just going to lose that person, right? Like the perception of crime is very important. I think that the issue that's really confronting the United States right now is sort of unfolding on a lot of different levels. But we have a sort of mismatch between what our perception of where the problem is coming from and how the problem is actually going to be solved. What do I mean about that? During this whole 2020 moment, if you said, hey, look, Black people are dying at highly disproportionate levels to police violence, which just absolutely is true. It's just a fact. Yeah. Conservatives would tend to say, like, well, hold on a minute, but they're killing themselves in Chicago, and what about Black on Black crime? But of course, both of those things can be true at the same time, right? That's true. In fact, part of the problem is that there's such deep distrust of the police in these communities that nobody wants to go to the police and tell them when they've been witness to an act of violence. There's a culture of stop snitching. And so it's really difficult for the cops to sort of practice preventative policing. But ultimately, you have to build that trust with the community. I think that liberals and lefties have to accept it. Like, people are just super, super sensitive to crime. One of the things that I say in the book, at the exact same time as the activist class were shouting, defund the police, in the polling, a majority of Black Democrats were not saying defund the police. A majority of Black Democrats were saying, maintain the current police presence or even increase it in my neighborhood. Right? It's a perfect example of what I'm talking about when I say that there's just a difference in the lived experience of a Black Lives Matter activist and the average Black person. And so you have to confront these as complex social issues and not get into a slogan fight, Because if you are the one saying, "Oh no, crime's not a problem," to a bunch of voters who are scared about crime, you're just going to lose their votes.
Mm-hmm. And in the title of your book, you talk about how the elites ate the social justice movement, and I've heard you talk about nonprofits, other organizations, corporations. Sure, went crazy, falling over themselves. I think it's BlackRock that isn't it the BlackRock company that has, that forces some sort of calculator justice system on corporations that do that. Is that what you're talking about in your book when you mean, like these elites and organizations that are eating the social justice system and maybe don't do justice?
Sure, that's part of it. I mean, look, like the sort of the classic example is the gay rights movement after the legalization of gay marriage. So, my parents were close with a lot of activist style people. My father had lived in New York for 10 years, and he knew a lot of people who were sort of in the sort of early gay rights fight. And back then it was like genuinely just radical just to be gay and to call for gay rights and gay marriage. One of the things that happens in the history of progressive movements is winning is de-radicalizing, by which I mean simply the fact that gay people won the right to marry resulted in, like, just kind of inarguably, in my opinion, resulted in like a de-radicalization of what had been the gay marriage movement. A lot of people did what anyone does, what most people do with politics, which is they got the right they wanted and they went off to, have families and raise kids and just sort of just be people, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But what happened next was that, a lot of these corporations saw opportunity for good press. And so if you go to a pride parade now, a major pride parade, Bank of America is handing out pens, right, at the pride parade. You go to like a big defense contractor like Raytheon, and they've got pride flags flying from their flagpoles out front. Nobody in the activist class takes that seriously. They all sort of say, "Oh, they're just being opportunistic." But what it inevitably does is it just sort of sucks up sort of public understanding of what these issues are and sort of aligns them with institutions. Of course, also the political parties are guilty of this too. So there's this famous picture that after George Floyd was killed, you have all these Democratic leaders like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, and they are wearing literally kente cloth. So it's a traditional African cloth, and they kneel, right, sort of in respect for George Floyd. And it's like, okay, but like, that's cool, but you make the laws, right? Like, your job is not to put on kente cloth and to kneel. Your job is to make the laws that are actually going to result in a more racially just society. And that's the sort of thing I'm talking about.
So a lot of social signaling or virtue signaling going on without a lot of substance, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there's this old saying, it's easy to do good, but it's hard to do good well, right? That's one thing that I don't do in the book is I'm not making fun of anyone who was impassioned in that moment. I'm not making fun of anyone who got radicalized. I'm not trying to make anyone regret what they were sort of feeling. I am saying that there's a reason why it's really difficult to make real positive change. I would say that if you're looking at racial justice specifically, you can say arguably that like the sort of movement for racial justice, whether you want to call that the sort of civil rights era and the Black Power era, the sort of Jesse Jackson Rainbow Coalition era, now the Black Lives Matter era, since about 1965, there's been a lack of results. And I would argue that lack of results stems from the fact that there's not a real clear sense of what the ask is, right? Like in politics, you got to know what you want, right? The civil rights movement took a long time to get going for obvious reasons. But when it got going, it really made a lot of headway quickly because they knew exactly what they needed. So the Voting Rights Act came first. Why did the Voting Rights Act? Why was that the top priority, if nothing else? It was the top priority because if you don't secure the vote for Black people, if you don't protect their right to vote and make it a federal crime to stop them from voting, then none of the rest matters because they're going to remain disempowered. So you say, okay, we got that. Now it's a federal crime if people stop us from voting. The National Guard was deployed to places to ensure that Black people could vote. Okay. And they have the Civil Rights Act, right, which is made up of a whole bunch of non-discrimination clauses and ways to tear down Jim Crow and segregation. You can't have a lunch counter with a sign up that says no coloreds anymore, right? That's great. But then the question became, what next? And in fact, if you read Martin Luther King's work from late in his life, he was open about the fact that he was frustrated with the lack of progress. But the problem is they couldn't settle on an actual demand. You have seen reparations has been something that has sort of floated around semi-seriously for decades. You have this sort of now thing with the prison industrial complex and the war on drugs, etc. There hasn't been that one thing to ask for. And when there's not that one thing to ask for, it's really easy to not get what you want.
There you go. And correct me if I'm wrong here in my memory of this, but one of the challenges Martin Luther King had was the fighting the other leading voices in the party or in the group of folks who want to reform. Like Malcolm X, was more violence and whatever, Black Panthers and stuff. And so, the fight over what is this message, how we get out, is very true. Do you see that? Do you? So is your supposition that these huge organizations, these elite voters, have just kind of hijacked the movement for the feel-good virtue signaling and sales of whatever product they can move and I don't know, so you can look good around people on social media and maybe get chicks or something. I don't know. I see a lot of virtue signaling with my, people that are on the far left. I'm a moderate Democrat, by the way, full disclosure. But I can see both sides of the party, and I'm not happy with the extremes on either side. And so, do you think it's that, or do we need to also place some blame on the average person who votes or doesn't vote?
Yeah, I mean, look, I believe so. You can look at any election and you can say, okay, the Democrat got this many votes and the Republican got this many votes. But also there's another one, which is like people who didn't vote, right? The last time that's a presidential election was held where one of the candidates got the more votes than people who did not vote was Teddy Kennedy. Okay. Not Teddy Kennedy, Theodore Roosevelt, excuse me. Theodore Roosevelt's election was the last time that a candidate got more votes than the number of people who did not vote. Okay. So we've got this issue. Now, I'm among those who say that we have to look at this scenario as saying we need to give them something to vote for, right? It's not, it's very easy to say, oh, they're so apathetic, they're sitting on their ass, they don't care. A lot of people care, but they don't see real distance between the two parties in terms of what they're offering, and they don't see a lot that's worth supporting.
That or they don't pay attention to even know.
Yeah,
but they're busy watching The Bachelor or whatever's on Instagram, I guess.
Yeah, so I want to talk about this idea of like moderate Democrat position, because I think that what gets defined as a moderate position is very important and not discussed enough. So I am not a moderate, but let's look at the child tax credit expansion. So for those listening who don't know, there is a child tax credit in this country so that if you have kids, you get some money knocked off of your federal taxes. There was an expansion of that program that was passed as part of one of the big COVID relief bills, where for a single year, this program was expanded such that it became somewhat more generous, and parents could actually, instead of just taking money off of their taxes, they could get a refund so they could get cash money for this thing. It's very common in many, many countries to have some sort of cash benefit for parents in order to pay for whatever. That program, to me, right, that was sort of set up to be a sort of a dream of what the left wants. But if you actually look at the history of the Democratic Party, that kind of universal cash benefit for an identified population that has an unusual financial burden. Social Security for the elderly, Medicare for the elderly, Medicare, Medicaid for the disabled, etc. Social Security payments for people who are permanently disabled, such as the blind, etc. That is actually right in the center of the party's wheelhouse. That is just the sort of thing that the Democrats do really well. That kind of a program tends to be very popular. It's actually much cheaper than you might think when you actually look at how much, like, do out sort of how much it actually costs. And it has this beautiful sort of scenario where it is race neutral. Anyone who's a poorer parent can draw from this money, right? It is means tested, so you don't get it if you make above a certain amount of money. So it's restricted to people on the bottom. But even though it's race neutral and white poor parents and Hispanic and Asian, whatever, the people who benefit the most from it are Black parents because of the distribution of poverty in this country. So it has this function where it could cut child poverty in this country dramatically. It is a benefit that's generous enough that it's going to give people the opportunity to take care of things for their kids without being so generous that it's a disincentive to work, if you want to talk about that. And it is race neutral, and any people can take advantage of it if they're poor enough, but it also has this nice effect of being disproportionately helping Black people because they tend to be more impoverished. That to me is not extreme, right? It's only extreme in the context of sort of contemporary Democratic politics. You know, Joe Manchin was the one who killed that program. And Joe Manchin is seen as, like, you know, the most right-wing Democrat, senator from West Virginia, etc. That's a good example, though, where Social Security was not a radical left-wing program within the Democratic Party of the New Deal coalition, right? Medicare and the various Great Society programs was not a radical position within the Democratic Party of the 1960s. And I think that it's a question of how do you sort of frame what you see as what is moderate, less than sort of like this is objectively moderate or extreme, etc.
Definitely. You know, it's sometimes I think, I mean, there's criticism of us as Democrats that we don't communicate effectively our message, or there has been in the past at times. You know, trying to find stuff that's good for everybody, something that's towards the middle, and you know, the poverty of white people is very big, especially in the mid and central South. In fact, I think most of the social services are consumed by them, which is kind of interesting. Do you see what do you think about the criticism? Let me play devil's advocate. What do you think about the criticism of programs like that say they're buying votes?
Like, you could say that about almost any kind of public expenditure, right? Like, I mean, look, it is famously a tactic of the defense industry is to have parts of their process be done in as many states as possible. So I believe the stealth bomber, the old stealth bomber, literally had at least one part made in every state in the union, all 50 states, because that meant that if you tried to cut that program, 50 states worth of senators, right, had people on the phone, you're going to cut that and kill my job, right? I live in Connecticut, right? I'm from Connecticut originally. And it's a true blue, super sort of blue Democrat state. But the biggest industry here is insurance. The number two is the defense industry. We've got Sikorsky helicopter, right? We've got in Groton they make the nuclear submarines. The Colt firearm company is here. Pratt and Whitney makes the jet engines for the jets. It's very much a part of the sort of the MO of defense industry is to understand you spread your operation wide so that you have as much geographical representation in Congress as possible. Is that buying votes? I don't know, but it's just a reflection of the fact that, like, everybody's getting something out of the system, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't be too cynical about sort of who's getting money from what, because certainly the defense industry is getting a lot of our money.
There you go. And I suppose anybody who accuses it of buying votes would, I mean, that's they're trying to play they're trying to play those political cards. Do you find that with institutions and elites, uh, one of the challenges I had was when the overturning of Roe versus Wade happened. There was a lot of hair on fire screaming on social media, and appropriately so. People, I mean, it was a shock to the system. You overturned something that people kind of felt was a God-given right at this point, after what, 40 or 50 years or more. But I started asking people that were going hair on fire on Facebook, and I said, okay, well, this is great. You're really fired up about this. Let me ask you two questions. Did you vote for Hillary in 2016? Show up to vote. And are you registered to vote now and you're planning on voting in 2020?
Mm.
No.
Yeah.
I'm like, shut the fuck up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. I mean,
I did. I was there. I represented. So you didn't, and now you're complaining. And oh my God, voting has consequences, or not voting does.
I mean, abortion to me is. I don't think people understand. It's like if you ever doubt the ability of a small group of motivated citizens to make change, you have to look at abortion rights in this country. When Roe v. Wade happened in the 1970s, in polling then, a significant majority of Republicans even favored a woman's right to choose. So we're in a context now where abortion is the ultimate dividing line, and where it's such a super passionate issue, and it's conservatives versus liberals and Democrats versus Republicans, etc. Accepting that a woman had a right to have an abortion was just sort of like a general popular opinion that was very common among both sides of the aisle back in the 1970s, 50 years ago. What happened was that you had this group of people, of activists, pro-life activists, who were just super, super motivated, and they just went to work every day, and they refused to take no for an answer, and they fought like hell inside of the Republican Party, and they made abortion a litmus test where if you're going to be a national Republican, you better be pro-life, or else we're going to come and get you. And eventually they created a condition where the court was sufficiently skewed towards conservatives, where they got what they wanted. Now I'm a pro-choice guy, so I think that's unfortunate, but in 50 years, they completely changed public opinion, and they were able to get rid of Roe v. Wade. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important that people not become too cynical about their ability to sort of make change within the system, right? Because if you really believe in something, and you really pursue it, and you use the sort of power that you have within your party, you can make something happen. I will say that this has led to a bunch of Democratic victories, right? And one of the things that happened immediately after Roe v. Wade went out is that, like, people are like, wait, they got rid of abortion, and now suddenly they're winning a bunch of elections that they could have lost. And that's just how American politics functions. One side wins some, and then it's clawed back.
There you go. And you lead into the point I was trying to make, where the apathy of voters who don't show up, and then they wonder why change happens, and oh my God, things. Voting or not voting has consequences. What I mentioned earlier about the people who don't show up to vote and who don't care, and this is another way why social change fails, because I've heard so many people. It doesn't matter which president you do or whether it's left or right. I've heard so many people be like, "Well, we voted for that guy to go, fix this and whatever." And you're like, but you voted for the president to go in from one side, and you voted from the Congress to go in the other. And, for about 20 or 30 years, they've been doing this death match thing where, they just, I can't remember who the Speaker of the House was, who basically said, we're not going to pass anything Obama wants, Right. And, sometimes it's happening on both sides, where it's just like, if it's, that's a right thing, we're not going to do it. If it's, that's a left thing, we're not going to do it. Instead of trying to, have that old sort of, Tip O'Neill or Pryor thing where we try and figure stuff out. Yeah. And do you think that your point to, like, these politicians who do the virtual signaling, but they don't do anything about it when they have their hands on the ability to do something about it. And then, of course, we have these voters who have their hands on the ability to do something, but they don't show up to vote. Who's the bigger one at fault? Is the elites, or is the voters that just don't give a shit, and then they're all angry because, oh my God, voting has consequences.
So I think that I would sort of distribute the blame here. I would say that, and again, like this is true of Republicans as well as Democrats in their own way. I focus on the left side because I am on the left and I want my side to do better. So that's what I'm trying to sort of tell them how to do it. That's the point of the book. Mm-hmm. It is just the case that like there is in-group politics and there's out-group politics. When you're in your group politics, you want to be more extreme and you want to sort of be more pure. When you get to the out-group politics, you want to be more compromising and you want to shade towards the center so that you can win, right? Part of the problem with what's happened in American politics is that the internet eliminates the distinction between in and out group politics, right? Like literally, it just used to be the case where, you'd be doing politics, like you'd be engaging in political debate in your union hall, right? And the local candidate, a Democratic candidate, would come and talk to you guys, and you'd talk it out, and you'd sort of have the kind of arguments that now happen on Twitter, right? Mm-hmm. And then that's the in group, and then you'd send the candidate out to sort of win the election, and in the election he wouldn't talk the same way he'd talk in that space, right? Because you have to operate on multiple levels. Mm-hmm. In the internet era, everything is happening in the same space all the time, right? Like the social distance between the inner space and the outer space, the in-group conversation and the out-group conversation has been shattered. If you are someone who is a candidate and you go to a small meeting of, people who are sort of affiliated with a given political movement, there's going to be somebody with a cell phone camera there, and it's going to have video of you saying the extreme thing that you say in the in-group, and that's going to go out on Twitter. And if you are a politician and you say something so in a big speech for everybody to hear, well, that's going to get taken back to the people in the in-group, and they're going to know that you said something that's not the same as what you said in the out-group. So that's one just structural problem with American politics right now is it's gotten harder to have a difference between the message that you say to people in your party, in your group, in your ideology, and a message for the public writ large. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the public, though, right, as you suggested, they don't make a lot of sense, right? Like the general average member of the public doesn't appear to have very coherent politics. A very long-standing finding in polling is you do a poll of people. And you say, okay, are you big government or small government? Well, I'm small government. And you say, should we deficit spend? Should we rack up the national debt, or should we live within our means? Live within our means. Okay, so we're small government. We're going to live within our means. And you say, okay, which of these programs are you going to cut? And you say military, Medicare, Social Security, and they say none, right? So they want a small government balanced budget, but also don't cut any of the programs at all, right? And that's just how people operate. Like politics happens at such a level of abstraction that it's hard to sort of identify when you're being a bit of a hypocrite.
That's true. And there seems to be a lot of hypocritical things that go on both sides, and maybe we need to identify that more. So what do you hope people learn from in your book? And do elites need to change their behavior? Do companies need to quit mucking about? We've seen the kerfuffles with like the Bud Light thing. Maybe less social signaling. Do politicians need to get in and do the dirty work as opposed to just focusing on these hot topic issues but never do anything about it?
Yeah, so I think that just sort of gets to what I was just saying about inside and outside. A fundamental problem that the left has right now is the way you become a person of influence in the left of center, whether that's moderate Democrat, liberal, left of liberal, whatever. The way you become a person of influence, the way that you sort of like get sort of a position of power, an audience, whatever, it's like within like the system of like American meritocracy, right? you bust your ass in high school, you go to an elite college, you probably go on to a graduate degree of some kind, and then you end up, if you're going in media, you end up maybe at like The Atlantic, right? Or the New York Times. Or you go to into academia and you end up at a really exclusive liberal arts college, or you go with the sort of think tank / nonprofit route and you end up at the Ford Foundation, etc. And like that's sort of like the progression that you go through to become a person of influence. And the problem is that progression, right, produces people who talk in a weird way, who have politics that are kind of extreme, who have politics that are much more focused on social and cultural issues than on pocketbook issues. People go through the process of becoming sort of elite within these spaces because they want to be part of the conversation, but in doing so, they lose the ability to talk like a regular human being. It's always been the case, right, that there is a sort of elite class who guides the parties. But again, it used to be a lot easier for those people to stay out of the way, right? Mm-hmm. So you had in the 1960s, you had the Democrats had, this concept of the best and brightest, which was like this sort of layer of these elite college grads who were very well credentialed and who knew everything, but they weren't on the campaign trail, right? They sort of directed policy, but then, you would go on and you would send out LBJ, right? Who was a guy who knew how to speak to the people. The problem now is, right, like if you want to know what elite Democratic position is or opinion is, you go on Twitter where everybody's performing for each other, right? Or you listen to their podcasts, right? Or everybody is available all the time. Yeah. And we have a fundamental problem that people who go through these elite spheres, they can't say like black people, they say black bodies, whatever the fuck that means, right? It's like a big thing that they say, right? Like they don't say homeless anymore. They say the unhoused, right? And most people, when they say it, you say, oh, the unhoused or black bodies, they don't say, okay, I'm going to educate myself. They're going to say, what are you talking about? I don't know what that is. So that's like just a fundamental problem. And so I think one thing that I want people to absorb from the book is that like, the average, Dartmouth University graduate who then goes on to get a prestigious internship and then lands at a nonprofit group that is staffed entirely by people like them, where just everyone is from the academic elite like that. That is a system for producing people who appear out of touch to most of the country.
There you go. These are great points. Do you think this contributes to why people don't show up and vote? Why people feel out of touch with government is because, everyone's talking so elitist. I can see how that sounds really, what's the word I'm looking for? It really sounds like you're playing people when you're talking down to them, or you're telling them what their experience is while you're sitting eating your tofu in your high-rise condo and your Tesla, and you're trying to tell someone who's living in poverty, paycheck to paycheck, and at the ends of our society, you're trying to tell them what their experience is.
Yeah, and I want to say this, Chris, to be very clear to your audience and to you. I am one of these people I'm talking about. All right, let's be real clear here. I have a PhD. Okay, I am a professional writer with a PhD who had lived in Brooklyn for the better part of a decade, and et cetera, et cetera. I am not saying that I am the man of the people. As I say in the book, right, I know how to critique these people because I've been among them for my entire adult life, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not advancing myself as someone who's more pure or more real or more down to earth. But what I am saying is sooner or later, there has to be an acknowledgement, right, that you can understand and believe in and see value in the concept of intersectionality, for example, which is a very prominent sort of cultural studies, lefty kind of philosophy. You can value that, but understand that the rest of the world sees you when that's the term that you keep using in your daily day-to-day engagement with other people. When that goes into your position paper that you write as a nonprofit, when that is in the article that you write for the Washington Post. And it is alienating to them. Yeah. They don't know what that is. They don't have the benefit of $80,000 a year college education. And there has to be some grappling with maybe the reason that people think we're out of touch is because we actually are out of touch.
There you go. Becoming self-aware. You make a good point. It's alienated in the language and well, you're trying to utilize this principle of self-grandizing or virtue signaling, combined with, well, we want to help people. I think some people have an intent to help people. It's the delivery that's the problem. It's always the intent that takes you to hell. But I think you're right. It's alienated. It's talking down to people when you're not speaking in their sort of language. And maybe that's the reason a lot of people don't vote in this country, because they're just like, I don't feel like I'm part of this system. And we have gotten out of control with Citizens United and several different things where, basically as a billionaire, buy justice, pick your Clarence Thomas and, hey, I own a jet plane and a justice. A lot of this is really kind of amplified, these elites and stuff. So to maybe people on the left, as you're calling us out, need to be more self-aware of that. And maybe we need to be like, maybe we should talk about the kitchen table sort of products as opposed to these virtual signaling social movement things that don't ever really seem to hit the pavement, or maybe they'd hit the pavement better if we didn't.
In the book, I quote from a pamphlet that the British government gave out after they developed their National Health Service. The country had been devastated by World War II. There was just rubble everywhere, and they were trying to sort of rebuild from the ground up. And so they created their National Health Service, and they gave a pamphlet, and it said, in the plainest language that possibly you can, it said, okay, this is our National Health Service. This is what it can do for you. Everybody gets to access it. You pay for it with your taxes, and here's some things about it. And at the end of the book, one of the pieces of advice I give is just tell people in plain language what you have done for them.
There you go.
If you look at like Obamacare, I think Obamacare had some good provisions, and I think that I'm glad that we have Obamacare rather than nothing. It was better than nothing. But like a fundamental political problem with Obamacare is people say, okay, what is Obamacare? And you say, well, and then you launch into a 20-minute dialogue about like just trying to explain the law, right? Because, okay, so, well, there's Medicaid expansion, but not all the states took advantage of it. And there's a provision that says that you can't be turned down for new coverage just because you have pre-existing conditions, but they can still turn you down because you can't pay and lots of other reasons. Also, no, the government doesn't give you coverage, but what it does do is it creates a series of marketplaces, and on those marketplaces, private insurers send you like potential offers, and they're rated gold, silver, or bronze for the record. And you have to cover a certain amount of coverage, but you can, if you want, choose coverage that's very minimal. Like once you start to do that, you've already lost, right?
Yeah,
like,
people are just glazing over in their eyes going,
right. Guess what? Social Security. When you get old, the government will give you back money it taxed from you so that you have money to live. That's a program that I know how to describe. And guess what? Social Security is incredibly popular, right? Because you just, hey, look, while you're working, we're going to take some money from you, and that's going to ensure that at the end of your life, when we used to have an elderly poverty rate of 40% in this country, it's single digits now, and it's single digits now because we made that program. You've got to be able to simply and coherently tell people what we have given you is this, and that's how you get people to vote.
There you go. I know the Biden administration has tried to target more what they call kitchen table topics.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of at the point too, because I've gone from the I was never far right, but I've gone from the right in the 90s and voting for Republican, which is interesting because George W. Bush embarrassed me so badly with the, basically monetizing it was called the Dick Cheney presidency, I think, monetizing Halliburton in the war. It's funny, I left the Republican Party because I was embarrassed over George Bush and his dumbness. Can you believe what I anyway, whatever.
I mean, George W. Bush is a perfect example of like how, like if you have enough balls, you can just sort of you can misrepresent even who you are. You ask the average person who's George W. Bush as a person, they'll say, "Oh, he's a country bumpkin from Texas." He was an aristocrat from Connecticut. What are you talking about? He's from a hugely wealthy New England family who went to Yale using skull and bones. But he just sold it. He just sold it so strong, you know?
Yeah. And he talked it too. I mean, he did sound like a country bumpkin half the time.
Yeah.
But and then I went to the far left, far liberal, and now I'm back at the middle because I think I like what you've talked about in the book. I become so tired. Well, social movements are there, and there's importance to them, and we need to fix some things. I get tired of the signaling of these extremes that we can't get back to the middle or we can't agree to the middle. It's our way or other or nothing. And the same thing on the right too. And these politicians that do all this virtual signaling, but as you mentioned in the show, you guys control the legislation. Like, go fix the damn crap and let's all get along instead of doing more signaling to, I don't know, voting that you're going to have come on your base that you know is going to come from that far extreme left. Let's try and get that middle voting out. And I know the Biden administration was trying to do more kitchen table things. I'm at that point. Okay, yeah, let's fix abortion and either make it legal or illegal, or let's all get together and try and find a way to make it work somehow, so everyone's happy, or at least everyone can agree that there's some way that can be done. But can we fix the goddamn roads? Can we get my bridges to quit falling down? That might be a cool thing. I like the child stuff. Can we, I don't like hearing that kids show up to school and they don't have food. My mom was a teacher. I've heard how the horrors of that. Can we help mothers and maternity, and can we do a lot of these social things that they do in other countries that just form a good country, a humane thing, these kitchen table things. I don't want to hear about, hey, okay, the trans movement is very important to me, LGBTQ, et cetera, but some of these things, like what's gone on with people want to change their sex and all that stuff. That's like, I think I read the figures on it. It's maybe 1% of the country or 2% of people in the country that want and really need that and are interested in that. That's a great thing. Let's do that. But you would think that 95% of the country were arguing about that in, the way the politics and the way they milk it and the way they, run everybody, and politicians are running around, their nose hair is on fire. Like, this is the thing we need to talk about. I watch political debates where they talk about things and you're just like, man, can you just fix my fucking roads and maybe help give us more jobs? Let's quit running around with these things. But it's kind of like the elites and politicians have gotten sucked into this virtual signaling, and then they go back to their offices and go, which stocks do you need to buy this week?
Right.
I don't know.
I mean, look, like I think that it is a constant throughout history that politicians will start to demagogue on social issues that are not unimportant, but that are just not as relevant to the vast majority of people as much broader issues. So, if you look at, like, for example, the sort of the border crisis, right? We do have a crisis. The best way to solve it is going to be sort of like contentious no matter what, right? There's no sort of like, just sort of like, hey, I've got one weird trick that's going to make everybody agree on immigration. It's just not going to happen because people just don't agree. Yeah. But we could at least have the debate about how many people to let into the country and how and who to choose it, etc. If you looked at, like, Trump, who for years, is this the first time we said the word Trump in this podcast?
Probably. It's kind of shocking.
That's crazy. Yeah, an hour in. That's wild. But Trump would not talk about immigration without talking about the gang MS-13, right?
Yeah.
And MS-13 are bad guys. I don't like MS-13, but like, that's just such a minuscule little element to the broad immigration debate. But he did it because it's effective. Because if you do that, right, if you keep sort of saying, hey, here's MS-13 over here, then people won't notice that, like, you don't really have immigration policy, right? Like you don't actually have like a policy that you want. You don't have a coherent sort of idea in that way. I there are some problems that are just like, we just got to fight them out, right? There are problems that we just sort of have to have out, and they're going to be uncomfortable. And you and I would disagree about plenty of it. I do think that if we're going to start anywhere, if we want to have any sort of sense of bipartisanship or sort of coming together to understand our problems, I think we should start here. Okay. This country is far richer than it was 50 years ago. But many people are struggling more than they would have 50 years ago because of the increase of the price of housing, education, right, and healthcare. Like those three things have grown so enormously in their costs over the past half century, totally obliterating the sort of gains we've made in average wages, like just far increasing far faster. I don't think there's any reason that we can't sort of say as a country, okay, look, like we clearly have a really serious costs problem with housing, education, and healthcare. There are three things that people can't just choose to go without, right? And by education, I'm including daycare, which is just insanely expensive now. Right? And if you can't get daycare, then your kids can't, then you can't work. And if you can't work, then you can't, like I would like to see people sort of talk about those three things as a unit and say, they've gotten hugely more expensive. We've got to figure out why. And we have to come together and find some sort of way to fix this, because we're just not going to ever see any real positive gain in people's wages that means anything if their mortgages, their rent, their insurance premiums, their daycare payments are going up so high that it eats all of that money. Like that's a good example of where I think there might be the opportunity for some real bipartisanship. Maybe I'm naive.
Are you saying that Reaganomics trickle down didn't work?
I am indeed saying that it did not, in fact, trickle down. Yeah.
Damn it.
Yeah.
I was betting on that. I saw somebody on TikTok do this video, so I'll just quote the numbers and don't sue me for not being accurate, because I'm not sure if they are, but they sound they are since and he showed that housing is up 29% over the last 30, 40, 50 years, however long as I'm losing, I can't feel my legs anymore. I'm that old. Housing, childcare, all these costs, education, like you mentioned, are up 20 to 30%, where with wages, and I think his numbers may include the last few years of increase, only went up 6%. So we're asking people to afford all these things, and I've been watching the middle class die since the mid 80s, and I've been watching it slowly disappear, and it's getting worse. You were hearing about people in Florida who can't insure their homes anymore because of legislation there that made it harder for them to sue and people to sue and whatever. You can't insure your home, and I was like shocked by that. I'm like, holy crap! There's people now going on insurance. I mean, it's really time that we said, hey, politicians, quit doing those signaling of the flags of the social things. Fix what's wrong in this country for everybody. And then let me ask you this. I know we're going along on the show, but this is great stuff. Do we also, as whether we're activists or elites or just the average human being, do we all need to start recognizing that we need to quit being so extreme? We need to start saying, how can we come together? How can we agree? How can we compromise instead of this far left, far right, just like our way or the highway?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would put it in those terms. Here's how I would put it, right? I want people to express their conscience, right? When some people express their conscience, they say that there should be no abortion under any circumstances. And I express my own conscience and say that's crazy, right? Because that's just how politics is and how it works. I don't want either of us to be less extreme in the sense that like we back off what our conscience is telling us. What I do want is to say this. Like a thing that I tell young lefties a lot is they're not just going to stop making Republicans. In other words, when you're in the process of thinking about the potential future, it has to be an actual like potential future, right? You need to bake into the cake the fact that like there's always going to be people who you can't stand who have as much influence as you do, and you're never going to get everything that you want. So you don't compromise on your deeply held moral beliefs, but you understand as an adult, like, shit, I'm just not going to get everything that I want. What can I live with in a way that I can go to sleep at night? That's not everything that I want, but is some of what I want.
There you go. A compromise. And living like an adult. Who knew? Self-accountability. You know, I've started a thing doing whenever politics comes up is I've started laying a foundation of saying, okay, if we're going to talk about this, I want to lay a foundation. We're all Americans here. And we're going to talk as fellow Americans. You're a fellow American of mine. We're all Americans. That's more fucking important. The Constitution is more important than whatever the shit else you want to talk about from here on out. And everything revolves around that basis. And it's interesting to me establishing that foundation. And even if I have to call it back, whoa. Hey, we're Americans first. So what do we need to do for America? Fuck the left, fuck the right. And I'm not saying totally, but in the conversation, what do we need to do as Americans? And so that's kind of helped keep some of the conversations I've had more grounded. And people have kind of had an aha moment where they go, wait, we are Americans. And it recognizes that we're two people. We're going to have to compromise on, you know, the extremes or what people want. But that used to be what this country was kind of good at. You know, I mean, Tip O'Neill did would compromise. But, you know, once we got, who was the Republican Newt Gingrich in, you know, it was like fucking the highway or nothing. And it's kind of been that way ever since. So great discussion. Any final thoughts, Freddie, as we go out?
My final thoughts is that you can learn all about these issues and more in the new How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement by me, Fredrik deBoer, out next Tuesday.
There you go. September 5th, 2023. You can order it wherever fine books are sold. Give me your .com, Freddie, wherever you want people to find you on the interwebs.
Yeah, it's Freddie Substack. Freddie, sorry, I can't even remember my own web address. FreddieDeBoer.substack.com. But if you just put in my name into Google, that's the first thing that pops up.
There you go. How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement. I don't want to see what happened after it passed through their system. But maybe that's where we are today. Maybe there's a joke there, a second book, Freddie. Anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in. We certainly appreciate you guys being here. Remember, we're all Americans, damn it. I mean, the show's international, so those of you who are American, we're all Americans, just so you know. You might want to remember that first. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, and all those great places on the internet. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.